Our story for this week is it's called Vaqueros, and it is an informational text. If we look at the genre, it says an informational text gives facts and details about a topic. As you read, look for text features like headings that organize the information and help explain the topic. We're going to see photographs and captions, and we're going to see domain-specific words that help you better understand the topic. Domain-specific words, if you remember, are words that you may not see in a lot of other places unless you're reading about this certain topic. So our story, Vaqueros, America's First Cowboys, and it is by George Ancona. Imagine 500 years ago, there were no cows or horses in North and South America. Thousands of years earlier, there had been horses, but they disappeared. Since there were no cows, there were no cowboys. Of course, today there are cowboys. It's all because of Christopher Columbus. The journeys. After his voyage to the Americas in 1492, Christopher Columbus returned to Spain. He told the Spanish king and queen of the riches to be found in the paradise he discovered. He described the native people who lived there. The royal couple agreed to more voyages. They needed gold to help pay for their expanding empire. The following year, Columbus returned to the West Indies. He brought 17 ships loaded with over 1,000 settlers, horses, and cattle. The ships dropped anchor at an island they named Hispaniola. Today, the island is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. For the next 25 years, Spanish ships sailed in and out of Hispaniola. The Spaniards explored and conquered the nearby islands. The native islanders were enslaved. Thousands died of smallpox, a terrible disease for which they had no resistance. As the islanders disappeared, they were replaced by the settlers and their animals. Here's a photograph, or not a photograph, a drawing. It's not a real photo. And you see the caption beside of it explains the picture. It says, Christopher Columbus landing on the island of Hispaniola, 1493. And then our next picture, the caption says, Hernán Cortés brought horses back to the mainland of North America. In 1503, Hernán Cortés, a Spanish adventurer, arrived in the West Indies. He spent several years helping to conquer Cuba. Then in 1518, Cortés set out with a fleet of 6 ships to explore the nearby coast to the west. On board were 500 men and 16 horses strong enough to carry a man in full armor. The ships dropped anchor near where the port of Veracruz, Mexico is today. The Teutonic people who lived there welcomed Cortés. They offered to help him conquer the hostile Aztec Empire that had long dominated them or ruled them. Cortés did so in 2 years. He claimed all the lands in the name of the Spanish king. He called the land New Spain. It wasn't long before the Spanish conquerors brought more livestock to the colonies. The animals were allowed to graze on the open grasslands. Many took off into the wilderness, forming large herds of wild horses and cattle. The expanding colony. The Spanish king rewarded Cortés and his soldiers with gifts of land. Throughout New Spain, they built ranches called haciendas and prospered. Accompanying the soldiers and settlers were Catholic missionaries. They had come to convert the native people. They moved north, building missions and churches along the California coast, extending or stretching the lands of New Spain. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado organized an expedition into the northern territories. Coronado was searching for the legendary golden cities of Cibola. Along with the men and supplies, he brought 500 longhorn cattle to supply meat and hides. So here's our picture. We can see what is now the part of the United States. We have Texas, we have New Mexico and Arizona, California, several of our states. But back then, that whole area, including part of Mexico, was just referred to as New Spain. It says, review the map. What water sources run through the area known as New Spain? And then our picture says, an early vaquero lassos a steer. The expedition never found the city of gold. However, it did introduce the first longhorns to what is now the American Southwest, which is the part we just saw on the map. We live in the Southeast, so this is a little bit a different part of the United States. From those first 500 longhorns, 10 million had spread across the Texas plains by the 1800s. The soldiers and priests of New Spain were already acquainted with raising cattle in Spain. Many were skilled horsemen. Even so, they needed help in rounding up the livestock on their sprawling lands. At that time, it was against the law for any native person to ride a horse. But the ranchers and priests needed help. They taught the native converts to ride and use the lasso, a looped rope. These men who worked with horses and cattle were called vaqueros. In Spanish, the word means cowmen. When the vaqueros, a new culture, took root in the West, it lives on today. It says Coronado introduced the longhorn. A herd of mustangs. A way of life. The vaquero's job was to keep tabs on cattle in the wild and round them up. It took many vaqueros to surround a herd so that it could be moved to the hacienda. These roundups are called rodeos in Spanish. Rodeo comes from a verb that means to go around. So in Spanish, we hear the word rodeo. Of course, we know that word in English, we would say a rodeo. The vaqueros were also needed to capture the wild horses that flourished on the prairies and valleys of the large haciendas. The vaqueros called the horses mesteños, a word that would later become mustangs. Vaqueros spent most of their lives in the saddle, riding hard in all kinds of weather. At night they sat around the fire where they cooked their meals. They told stories and sang songs about their lives. Then they rolled up into their ponchos to sleep. From California to Texas, native vaqueros were acknowledged to be the best horsemen in the world. And here's a picture, an early vaquero with his lariat. Doing the job. A vaquero had to cope with a rough landscape and harsh weather. He needed the right tools to do his job. Vaqueros wore wide-brimmed hats called sombreros. Sombra means shade in Spanish. The sombrero protected vaqueros from the burning sun. A vaquero also wore chaparreras, or chaps. These were leather leggings worn over trousers. They protected the vaquero from cactus, thickets of wild brush, and rope burns. The horses belonged to the owner of the hacienda. The vaquero, however, owned the saddle that he put on the horse. The saddle had to be comfortable for both horse and rider. The vaquero's feet slid into two wooden stirrups that hung from the saddle. A vaquero's most trusted tool was his lasso, also known as the lariat. Often a vaquero would have to gallop after a runaway steer. He would toss the loop of the lariat around the steer's horns, neck, or foot. Then he would wrap the rope around his saddle horn and rein in his horse. This would hold the steer or bring it to the ground. Once the herds were together, they calmed down and began to graze. Mounted vaqueros would separate the calves from their mothers to brand them with the hacienda's mark. Here's a picture of a modern-day saddle, which of course modern means current times. The Vaquero legend. In 1821, Mexico won its War of Independence from Spain. All of New Spain became the independent nation of Mexico. The northern lands of Mexico, however, were difficult to govern. Many American immigrants crossed into the territory that would one day become Texas. Soon there was a large population of Americans in Texas. In fact, they outnumbered the Mexican residents who lived there for generations. With the Americans came changes in the culture of the vaquero. Even the word changed. When the Americans tried to say vaqueros, it came out vaquera. Later, the word became buckaroo. It was only after 1860 that men who worked with cattle were called cowboys. It says cowboys continued the culture of the vaquero. And here we have a little, looks like a poster or something. It says his first talking picture or a movie. And then it says Tom Mix and his wonder horse Tony. Destry rides again. So it's like an advertisement for a movie. In 1836, Texas declared itself independent from Mexico. 9 years later, it joined the United States. Then in 1847, Mexico lost a war with the U.S. As a result, it lost its northern lands. They would become the states of California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. After the end of the Civil War, the Vaqueros were joined by free slaves and young men from the East. These newcomers wanted a life. These newcomers wanted a new life in the wide open spaces. They had to learn what the Vaqueros had been doing for centuries. The large ranches needed many men to manage the huge herds of cattle on the vast prairies. Cattle drives would take weeks to travel from ranches to railroads. From there, the cattle traveled to the markets in eastern and western cities. The invention of barbed wire made it possible to build fences to keep cattle in pastures. The vaquero was not needed to ride the wide open spaces. Long cattle drives became unnecessary. The decline of the vaquero began. Yet the vaquero's traditions did not fade from the American imagination. At the turn of the century, the cowboy became the hero of the West. Books, magazine stories, and the early movies featured the brave exploits of the American cowboy. In this picture, we have a horse rears throwing its rodeo rider. Celebrating traditions. Today, the arts and skills of the vaquero can be seen in two countries. They appear in the charrerías of Mexico and the rodeos of the United States. Both vaqueros and cowboys pride themselves in their skills. They keep alive the traditions and cultures of their past. On September 14th, Mexicans celebrate El Día del Charro. It is a holiday of parades, church services, music, and charrerías. The charrería is a rodeo where vaqueros can exhibit their skills. They perform with charros and charras, gentlemen and women riders. The men dress in their elegant silver button outfits and large sombreros. The women wear the traditional dress of the China Poblado. Many of the events performed in rodeos and charrerías are similar. Both may include riding a bucking horse or bull or getting thrown off, for example. But, like the first vaqueros, the riders are ready. There is an old saying in the corrals. It goes, "There's never been a horse that can't be rode. There's never been a cowman who hasn't been throwed." The grammar may not be right, but the idea is pure cowboy. So I hope you enjoyed the story. Now on your task board, there's actually a couple of videos and links that you can go to and you can read more about vaqueros and early cowboys. I hope you've enjoyed.